This is another good example of how organisations can come together, collaborate, and show their respect and pay tribute to a significant individual. I'd like to warmly welcome the Lovett family: Jill, Ray, Ewan, Linda, Marie, Paige, and Ethan. One or two other grandchildren not here today, but we warmly welcome all of the Lovett family here. Ladies and gentlemen, board, staff members from VicDeaf, Deaf Victoria, Deaf Sports Australia, and Deaf Sport Recreation Victoria, welcome one and all. It's my great pleasure to be MC today. I won't tell you stories that I have with John. I'm very fortunate to have him as a second father figure to me. I have many stories to tell. We're bonded through football, as you know, and we're both Bulldog supporters, have attended hundreds of games, and he would be my primary role model through the deaf sports community and the deaf community. We lost John too early. However, his legacy still lives on. People still talk about John. Even when I go to the Deaf Olympics Congress, most recently this year, people spoke about him. No matter where I travel to around the country, his influence can be seen everywhere. 10 years later, it's still a very strongly felt influence. I'd like to also welcome those that never had the opportunity to meet or work with John. I'm sure that you'll learn a few important things about this man today. We have 4 organisations who will be represented by one person who will be sharing some information about John and the contribution, impact, and support that he provided to that particular organisation and those communities. So first of all, I'd like to welcome Mac Adam to the stage. Mac will be speaking from the VicDeaf perspective. Well, hello. My name's Mac Adam, and I'm the president of the Victorian Deaf Society Board. It's a true honour for me to be asked to speak about John and his family here today. "10 years ago, time really does fly. 10 years ago, we were still young, and we are still young today. And Brett was right in that John has a long-lasting legacy. I recently was at the Deaf Olympics in Bulgaria, and the ICSD, which was formerly known as the CISS, International Community of Sports for the Deaf, spoke to me about many different matters and John's involvement in CISS and the change of presidents to ICSD. The new president is a Russian, and he spoke very favourably and highly of John and the contribution that John made to the organisation when he was a board director and president. I'm very pleased to see all of you here to support VicDeaf, especially Jill, Ray, Ewan, Linda, Marie, Paige, there you are, and Ethan. Lovely to see all of you here. I really am very pleased. I'm just going to cast my mind back now to when I was at school. I myself was a Victorian school for deaf children student. It was not known as VCD then, it was known as VSDC. And I was a daily pupil. At that time we were wearing shorts. We had legs, we could show them. And of course I had no hair on my legs at that time, I was just a young tacker. Still think I'm quite young today actually. At the time, living in Paran, I remember John was there, his parents had a shop. My parents lived close by in Paran as well, so we travelled from Paran to the school every day. I remember one particular day, I found out that John would be going to a new school. He was going to Brighton Grammar School. There were no interpreters in those days, particularly none in schools. But his parents made a wise decision to send John to that school. They wanted him to have a higher quality education, to provide him with better opportunities. And thankfully, John was able to use that education he received at Brighton Grammar School. So we thank them, but particularly John, for bringing all that he learnt with him to the deaf community. I was asked to give a 5-minute speech about a number of topics, and it's not easy to do that because there's so much to say about John. However, I would like to recognise a number of his successes. John was the first deaf person to be president of VicDeaf, the first deaf person in its history. Before that, there was resistance to a deaf person taking up that role. And I should say that he performed that role extremely well. At the same time, the organisation then was known as the Adult Deaf Society, transformed itself to the Victorian Deaf Society. Again, that was another success during John's time in the chair. John was the first deaf person to be selected to the VicDeaf organisation in his own right, to the board. In the past, we had a deaf community committee that had 3 members that would consult with the Victorian Deaf Board. So board members would have this conversation with deaf people, primarily because they're all hearing. However, John was the first deaf person to be invited and stood for election onto the VicDeaf board as well. Another major achievement. Sometime later, John became Director of Services here, in a similar role to what Brent Phillips is performing today. That's right. John was also the first person to become a manager in his own right here at VicDeaf. That's another huge achievement. And I think that after John, there'll be a number of deaf people following his footsteps, and Brent is here today. And the board is very happy and encourages deaf people to aspire to management positions within this organisation. John was the first deaf person in Victoria to also receive the Order of Australia Medal, the OAM, another high prestigious honour. And that really captured the interest of the deaf community. A great honour. And other deaf people have followed in his footsteps. Again, he's led the way. He's been a trailblazer. Really has been an extraordinary life and achievement. This centre, the VicDeaf board agreed to name in his honour. It's known as the John Michael Lovett Centre. This is where we are meeting today. An appropriate time, the weather's beautiful outside, the cloud in the sky, no rain, couldn't ask for more. We also have wonderful people to recognise this milestone with. If you look on my left, up here on the wall, you'll see a photograph of John. So interestingly, some time ago, I think someone went up to one of these 2 photographs over here on the right, and said, oh yes, I remember this social worker, and oh yes, I remember Ern Noble, I remember him. They went over there and said, oh, who's that? Because there was no plaque, so we had to attach some information to that photograph, because many people newer in the community don't know John, didn't have the pleasure of meeting him. So we rectified that by having some information under the photograph so people know who he is. John also received a prestigious award in his honour. You can see at the back wall, there's John's photograph up there. This was presented to his family recognition. We have the honour roll board as well at the back of the room, you can see. For deaf people who have worked extremely hard, VicDeaf wants to recognise their contributions. You can see that John Lovett's name has been added to that honour roll. And we want to see more deaf people following John's footsteps and create their own legacy in the same way that John has. So with those words, I'd like to hand over to the next person who's going to speak about John. Thank you. Many, many thanks, Mac. As Mac said, John had a profound impact upon this organisation. The first Deaf president, later on the first Deaf senior manager within this organisation, and this room is named in his honour, and John is all around. Not only this room, this floor, but this building and community. Thank you, Mac, for those words. I'd now like to invite Anne Bremner to present to us on behalf of Deaf Sports Recreation Victoria and John's contribution to that organisation.
Hello everyone. Hello Lovett family. I won't go through everyone's name. I'm sure people don't want to hear it 100 times. Okay, so I was asked to present and talk on behalf of DSRV. That's what it's called now, Deaf Sports and Rec Victoria, and I've just been asked recently, so please forgive me if I refer to my notes, because my memory isn't quite like it was before. So I'm very proud to be here today to present on behalf of VSAD, which turned into DSRV. So it is a great honour for me to speak about John. I had worked with him for over 30 years. I was involved in various committees alongside John, and he was always there at those committees. He was a wonderful person within the deaf community, very giving. He was a great man to work with. He had many ideas, initiatives. He was very conscientious and thinking of the community and how we could serve the community. He had a great vision. And he had fantastic, excuse me with this long particular word, but he had fantastic entrepreneurial skills, which means he was able to organise and corral people into making successful events happen. So, as you know, he was involved in very many different committees. And I started working with him in around 1970 to around 2000. So I'm going to talk about that time in my life and his. His ultimate aim was to ensure that deaf people received their rights, their human rights, to ensure that deaf people were involved in everyday life, where deaf people could have a say. And in the adult deaf society, as it was known then, we weren't able to do a lot of things autonomously. We had to ask for permission to do things. For example, if we wanted to book a room, we had to go through the Deaf Committee, the Victorian Deaf Committee, just to basically book a room. And as Mac mentioned before, we had 3 Victorian Deaf Committee representatives talking to the board on a regular basis. And when I first arrived at the Deaf Committee, I thought it was pretty good. We gathered in the Jollymont Hall. There were all men on the Deaf Committee, and they would arrive in their suits and ties, very, very formal. And I thought, goodness, I'm a bit scared of these men. They look very serious. And they would ensure that everybody watched Mr. Reynolds. If anybody had any side conversations, you were quickly pulled up and forced to watch Mr. Reynolds talk. So during that time, there were many changes, of course, not just within the deaf community, but in the hearing world as well. And I think I refer to those years, the 1970s to the 2000s, as the golden years. There were a lot of changes, a lot of new initiatives. For example, the TTY. We were very excited about being able to call someone via the TTY. That's just one example of one of the changes. John Lovett was particularly significant in the deaf community as well as the hearing community. he separated out the two tasks of welfare worker and interpreter. So previously a welfare worker was an interpreter, and John Lovett decided to separate those two roles out to make a difference in deaf people's lives. So he really lobbied for that particular change and had it happen successfully. And for interpreters to be trained and qualified. So around that time, DSRB began, but before that I'll talk about the Deaf Committee. Previously we weren't allowed to make any autonomous decisions on our own behalf. John Lovett started to think about this particular situation, and he thought, look, it's time for deaf people to take control of our own lives. So John considered the Deaf Committee that it should be wound up and split up into two separate groups, one for sports and one for what is now known as Deaf Victoria. So his vision and foresight achieved those goals in terms of splitting Deaf Victoria into two different organisations. So running those two organisations, JSSC was established at the same time in 1979. So the first AGM was chaired by John Lovett, of course. John would always stand up the front, and he also had a team of people working alongside him, but he really was the leader in the deaf community, and we mustn't forget. I came here a couple of days ago to talk about, because as I mentioned before, my memories are fantastic. I haven't quite got Alzheimer's, but John Lovett wrote an article that I wanted to go back over, and I'll talk about that now. So at the AGM of the Victorian Deaf Committee, only 30 people bothered to turn up. And that made me think, now, 2 or 3 days ago we had an AGM, and I counted how many people attended this AGM yesterday, and there were 35 attendees, and he was complaining about the same issue at the first AGM. Now remember, the Deaf Committee was 95 years old. So John Lovett decided to disband the Deaf Committee and separate the functions out. Now at the Deaf Committee there would always be around, at the Deaf Committee AGM there would always be around 70 to 90 people attendees, because there were 197 members. Where have these members gone? It's quite different to today. John Lovett was instrumental in the Deaf Committee, in VicDeaf, the Adult Deaf Society, and many organisations. There were a group of us who were strongly keen on sport, and we thought we need something for deaf people. We would go to our respective houses and have discussions about sport, and we decided to establish a steering committee. And the president was, of course, John. I was pretty excited. I was the secretary, and I would always sit alongside John and work with him to run these organisations. We eventually established 13 deaf organisations, deaf sporting clubs, and we had 2 representatives from each club establish a committee. The first committee I'm going to mention is, where's Leslie Mann? He was here before, I've seen him. He's not here now? All right. He was treasurer. And the committee comrade was, the committee consists of John McRae, Lance Haitley, up the back, I see you there, Peter Mavis, who is no longer with us, Graham Ball, also no longer with us, John Beach, Matthew Veal, who is no longer here, Julian Walsh. So it's good to know that John Lovett has good company up there. I'm sure he's got friends up there. And those who have gone, I'm sure they're still discussing what's going on with the deaf sports. Later on, John Lovett became my manager when I worked for DSA, or known as ADSF. He was a wonderful manager, as well as deputy manager. I couldn't ask for anyone better than John to be my manager at that time, and David Peters as well. John had many involvements within the community, and people thought he was particularly serious, but I don't think so. I know he knew how to have fun. And how do I know? Because I've heard stories. Now, there was a dinner for basketball one evening, netball for one evening. And I think we may have drunk a little bit too much, and we started to have a talcum powder fight. Do you know the drill? We all ended up white. John, I think you were the worst affected. You had the most talcum powder on. In Adelaide, for the Australian Deaf Games, we had the cake fight. John Lovett loved it. He was involved throwing cake at everybody. What a terrible person. So we had fun. It was wonderful, and he knew how to have fun. He was really particularly known for a particular gesture. So I want to say thank you to John Lovett, his everlasting supporting family. I want to thank John Lovett for his contribution to the deaf community. Thank you, everyone.
Many thanks, Anne. One story, just building on what DSLV said. John was the president of the Deaf Olympics organisation. I think about 2000 DSLV were on shaky ground, so John became president of DSLV at the same time. So he was there for the full term for both the local deaf sports organisation, the national and international. So John served in that role for about 2 years. You could just see John's wholehearted support for the deaf community, particularly sports. I'd now like to invite David Peters, who will talk about John's involvement and contribution to Deaf Sports Australia.
Hi everyone. It's lovely to see the Lovett family here again. I'm very honoured to talk about John Lovett and his life with us. I've known John Lovett since I was a teenager. He knows my family because he went to the same school as my sister, my older sister Pauline. And he worked with my older brother Graham in the public service in Port Melbourne. And that's how I met John Lovett. I was heavily involved, like John Lovett was the president for the first JSSC. I was the secretariat and manager for the bar at JSSC at the same time John was president. And I remember when I first started talking to John, I thought, oh, we first had a rookie relationship, you could call it. It was a rocky relationship, rather, because I was fairly young and he was older than me. And the Victorian basketball team went to the Australian Deaf Games in Adelaide in 1976, and John Lovett was the team manager of the time. And I was maybe 20, 21, pretty young. 21 I was. You remember how old I was. So we played basketball fairly well, but I had issues with the officials off-field. The accommodation, we just drank a little bit too much, had too many parties, forgot to eat, drank a lot of beer, and John never drank a beer. So we knew we'd be in a lot of trouble. So when we got home, John Lovett was team manager. He wrote a report about our behaviour, a scathing report. He said we were terrible in so many different ways. So when the VicDev committee received that report, they just threw it in the trash. Because the Victorian basketball team were the So John Lovett wasn't happy with me for a few weeks, but after that we developed a good long-lasting relationship. We worked together in deaf sports and in other areas. I was very fortunate to work with him here at VicDev. If I had any questions or issues, I'd always go and talk to John, discuss those issues. He would provide salient advice. Sometimes we would have debates about issues, sometimes we would agree to disagree, but we were able to move on and develop a good, long-lasting relationship. So John was the first president and I was the manager in JSSC. We were also involved in national and international sporting organisations. We were both in organising the first international event, the soccer in 1988 in Melbourne. So I learned a lot from John during that time. There were lots of interesting happenings, we had a lot of fun, it was a great time. I'd often share a room with John when we'd go and stay in hotels. And in 1996 at the Adelaide Games, we were back there again, John Lovett and I shared a room in the hotel, and I said, oh look, I need these clothes washed, John. And John said, don't worry. You know, he thought I was a little brother, and he was the older brother and I was the little brother. He said, I'll do your washing for you, David. I said, thank you. So I gave him my clothes for him to wash. So I got my clothes back after he washed them, and they were all blue. They were all blue. And I said, what? He had put in a dark navy polo t-shirt into the washing machine, and the dye had just infected every other piece of clothing. And that was a couple of days before the games had ended. So once Jill found out, John asked Jill for some advice in terms of how to wash clothes properly. So I really appreciate John for his wonderful leadership skills, his legacy and encouragement to the deaf community. When I go to Deaf Olympics, still now to this day people talk about John Lovett and the things he had done for the deaf community. So I would like to thank very much for his contribution to the deaf community. Thank you.
John was a life member, vice president, secretary, works in Australia, international conferences and congresses. His involvement in sports is profound. Now I'd like to move on to the next organisation, Deaf Victoria. Fortunately, Anne Darwin can't be here, she's unwell, so she's asked board member Rachel McQuillan to present Anne's notes, and then Phil will make a contribution to it. Rachel.
You may not be sure of who I am. My name is Rachel McQuillan. I'm on the Deaf Victoria board as of 2 weeks ago, so I'm very new. So I'm here to talk on behalf of Anne Darwin. She is a life member of Deaf Victoria, and unfortunately she's not well today. So she sends her apologies. She really wanted to attend today, but she's unable to. So I have a story from Anne that I will express to you all. So a few years ago, Phil Harper wasn't able to work for about 6 months. He decided to leave for a little while on leave, and Phil Harper was the VCOD coordinator, and Anne was president of VCOD. And I thought, oh, Phil's going for 6 months, what are we going to do? Who's going to replace him? How will we get this work done? And that night, who should come to her house? John Lovett. John said, look, I want this job. And Anne said, what? You want this job for 6 months? And John said, yes. So he got the job. He worked very conscientiously. He worked well. He went to a hospital for a knee operation during that time, but he still, in hospital, worked. He didn't waste any time at all. He kept working. I don't think he believed in wasting time, says Anne. So John liked to prepare everything, have everything organised and ready to go. He didn't like to waste time. Jill was treasurer at the time, and Jill said, look, you're spending too much money, stop it. So John had a mentor session, and he was a great leader. He was a brave man and a great role model for the deaf community. And so she learned a lot from John, and that she had arguments and disagreements with him, but regardless, they had a good friendship, and said she will always remember him in her heart. So now I'll hand over to Phil to talk about his days in VCOD. Thanks, Rachel. Hello everyone. Hello, Lovett family. It's great to see the children grow. Time does fly. Brent Phillips has asked me to say a few things, but that's impossible for me to talk about just a few things. I have many, many things to talk about, but no, I will keep it short and sweet. So I've met John Lovett way, way back before VCOD was established, over at Jolimont in the social scene. And he was a great leader. He had garnered a lot of respect in the deaf community. I really didn't know who he was, but it wasn't until I started working with him at VCOD that I saw him more often and became aware of his particular skills. So the first meeting I had with him was in 1981 at the Deaf Society at Jolimont, in that hall with the staggered seating, underneath the hall in fact. So John and Anne Bremner was there, Anne Darwin was there, deaf community members, and we all got together to decide to start advocating for deaf rights. So 1981 was the International Year of the Disabled Person, by YDP. So internationally, people were thinking about people with disabilities, and we were thinking about deaf rights, and we were thinking we don't need to be so passive and allow our lives to be controlled by others, that we can stand up for ourselves and advocate for ourselves. So that was the seed that germinated VCOD. VCOD was eventually established in 1982 with a group of committee members. And John Lovett was involved. Well, he wasn't involved directly, but he was involved behind the scenes. He provided a lot of support, leadership and advice as he was involved with the Deaf Society and deaf sports. He wasn't able to do everything. So as time went on, as David Peters mentioned, Jill was involved in the committee, John became vice president, and he really made the committee become a stronger, more stable environment for us to produce work that was valuable. So I went to Sydney a couple of weeks ago for the World Federation Conference, and as David Peters mentioned, in 1998 the Asia Pacific Soccer International Conference happened. This was the first international conference that was organised by deaf people in Australia. John knew a lot about sport, but most of us, we knew nothing. We knew about sport. John knew a lot about managing international events. We knew nothing. So John taught us how to organise an international event, the many things we had to do. We had people from China and India. We had no idea how to communicate with them. John Lovett was instrumental in advising us how to organise an international conference. The interpreters were all nervous. We didn't know what to do about interpreters. We didn't know what to do about different communication techniques. So really, the deaf community grew broader from that conference. And the awareness of the deaf community and interpreters and how they work really came about from that conference, and John Lovett led the first international conference that happened in Australia. And we linked out to the international deaf world. So as I mentioned before, we were thinking about deaf rights. We didn't have TTYs, we didn't have access to TTYs. We would have to ask our parents to ring people for us, ask the Deaf Society to ring for us. So via VCOD, we advocated for deaf people to access TTYs. This was in the year 1988, and you may recall in City Square there was a public speaking area, and the Lord Mayor came and talked with us, and we were talking there at the public square about our requirements for a TTY. Now this took 5 years before it came into fruition. It was mentioned before, Rachel mentioned my long service leave, where I left for 6 months and was replaced by John Lovett. He had a lot of energy, he was ready to work, as he had worked in the Deaf Society, and then he moved into the role of VCOD, which was maybe a bit of a demotion, but he, irregardless, had a lot of energy, wanted to strengthen the organisation and do some work. Our finances improved quite significantly, our work improved significantly, and he really kept this organisation stable and strong. So in the year 2000, VCOD asked him back to work on our first strategic plan. It was a new concept, it was a new initiative, we'd never done a strategic plan, and John Lovett was instrumental in guiding us and developing the concept, planning the strategy, and working with us in that area. It was rather than being reactive, being proactive in the community and also developing a strong foundation. And VCOD, as of last year, was 30 years old. Deaf Victoria, as it is now known, is 30 years old. So you can see an organisation grow from the seeds that were John Lovett's doing into becoming a leading organisation in Australia. Thank you.
Thank you, Phil and Rachel. Many thanks to the both of you. Just taking a step back, in terms of Deaf Sports Australia, you may see a cup over there on that white bench. That was known as the ADSF Cup, the Australian Deaf Sports Federation Cup. And recently, the DSA board decided to change the name of that to the John Michael Lovett Cup, because John actually donated the cup to ADSF, and as you know, such an integral member and provided great encouragement to the Australian deaf sports community. Now we have 2 short videos to share with you. We promoted this event, and then there are many people that wanted to attend but could not. And we have 2 videos from 2 people who could not attend. One, Colin Allen, the president of the World Federation of the Deaf. As you heard, John was the first deaf person to become president of an international deaf sports organisation. Colin is now an Australian who's also president of an international deaf organisation. Hello, Jill, your 2 sons and family that are gathered here on this auspicious occasion to commemorate the wonderful man that we know as John. It's amazing to think that 10 years has just gone. John hasn't been with us on this earth for 10 years. But in saying that, it doesn't mean that John has not been with us. He has given so much leadership, support, and his influence is still felt all around the world, particularly in relation to the CISS and the Deaf Olympics movement, as well as his involvement with the World Federation of the Deaf. I'm fortunate enough to have met John, and he gave me a great amount of confidence and instilled that confidence in me in terms of leadership, but not only me, I know he's given many other opportunities to younger people in Melbourne. And believe that you are very proud of the amazing work that John has done, particularly for younger deaf people, to encourage them to realise their potential and make a contribution. His legacy is still felt in the community in Melbourne, all around Australia, in fact all around the world. Internationally, deaf people have the privilege to have met John, have said that he's assisted them through his strong leadership and warm encouragement. John would always approach me and tell me what he was doing on the international stage. I listened with great interest, and I'm really pleased to have the opportunity to exchange information with him, to hear his views and opinions, and I thank John for that. Have a lovely afternoon celebration commemorating John, his life, the last 10 years without John. Great. Now we have a video from a very close friend of John's, Lovett, Adam, who's in London, who really dearly wanted to be here today but has sent a video. Hi everyone. I'm really pleased to be able to say a few words today to all of you. I'd like to thank Vic Deff, first of all, and Brent Phillips for agreeing to allow me to say a few words. I'm really disappointed I'm not with you in Melbourne, because I was with you up until last weekend. I'm now back here in London. Also, I missed Matthew Veal Pavilion launching. Even though I was in the country, I wasn't in Melbourne at the same time. So, unfortunately, sometimes those things happen. I'd like to say a few words about John now. I still can't believe that he's no longer here and he's been away for 10 years. But it's wonderful that you're here to commemorate and to remember John. I remember the day of his funeral. His family and many, many friends, colleagues, and other people from around the country that knew him that wanted to pay their respects to John, to his family and the life and the contribution that he made to our community. And I remember in the eulogy that I delivered, I covered off many of the achievements and the work throughout his life, and the fact that he was the first deaf person to be the president of Vic Deaf, also was the president of the International Committee of Sports for the Deaf, was a strong supporter and advocate for VCOD, and which is now known as Deaf Victoria. Also involved with many of their achievements, many meetings to set up the NAATI interpreting qualification for Auslan English interpreters. So John was at the forefront and made many inroads and improvements to quality of life for deaf people. He also had a wonderful sense of humour and loved telling stories, and I've got to tell you this one again. I was running late for work, I always was, and I was working with John at that time, and we had a meeting one particular Monday morning, 9 a.m. sharp. I'd always arrived late, okay, that's me, and I arrived late and John was waiting there at reception. I arrived, pointing to the clock, he said, "You're late, Robert, you're late. I need to teach you," and he was willing to also teach me a great deal about how I could do better at whatever it was and make the improvements. 10 years later, looking back on that day, thinking about John's contribution, who he was as a person, his work, I remember there were so many times things would be happening. Any type of unfortunate situation, I remember sometimes people would say, "I wonder what John would say if he were here today." Major issues, so you can see that it's a tribute to John because people still think of him and what he would say because they valued his opinion so much and his counsel. Life, of course, continues on. His family is still expanding and doing very well, and his aunt has since gone, but there's a new grandson in addition to the family, so it's wonderful to see life moving on, Lovett family continuing too, but still pausing to think of John. I'm really pleased that Vic Deaf have set up this opportunity for the John Michael Lovett Centre to be named in his honour. Many thanks again to John. I want to congratulate him and say that I hope you're all enjoying yourselves, thinking about John, being together, and enjoy talking about him and many other things. I look forward to seeing you all again soon too. Thank you and goodbye. Had a third video, but Donalda Ammons was unwell, so was unable to present this. Donalda was the Vice President of the International Committee of Sports for the Deaf, but was unable to present this, so sent an email. I'll just give you a chance to read it now. Some nice words from Donalda there. Okay, we're about to wrap up, but the four organisations have been able to find some photographs in the archive, so we'll have loop photos now. Thank you. Some wonderful photographs. You can see John's involvement in so many different organisations and people's lives. Now, I'd just like to ask Craig to say a few words on behalf of the Lovett family. Craig. Thank you, Brent. Thank you very much. Thank you for all coming today. I've seen so many people. I thought it'd be a small event, so a few people come. I'm quite surprised to see so many old friends here too, which is good. A few old faces as well in the audience. Good to see you again, so thank you for coming. Thank you for hearing the stories. Thank you, Mac, for delivering those. David and Rachel and Phil. Thank you. It's good to hear those stories about Dad. My wife Linda would agree that I can't wash. I can't wash clothes. I'm just the same. And Linda's saying yes here in the front row. I can't wash clothes either. So 10 years ago, at my father's funeral, we were very sad and shocked. We're all devastated. 10 years later, life has moved on. The time to stop, think and pause and remember my father's life. My family are very proud of his life. We all here have different memories of John. My mother, Jill, has good memories of her husband and their life together. My brother and I, Ewan, do, and his wife, Marie, and my wife, Linda, and I all have wonderful memories of this man who's our father. So it's not here. Many of you have memories of working with my father as well. And you've been lifelong friends of my father. I know growing up in the deaf community, here in Melbourne, it's a very strong, tight-knit community. My father loved being involved. So we were always out as a family. Mum and Dad, we were always out here at home. We were always going out, socialising with deaf people, doing all different types of things. My father's loved to be with people and be involved. He loved telling stories. He'd always tell stories and jokes as well. Good jokes, few and far between. Bad jokes, lots. Some of you know my father's bad jokes. I think it's important to remember my father. I'm really pleased to see this photograph here in this centre named in his honour. But the best way to remember this man is to tell our children about him and his life. Tell younger deaf people about his life and achievements. He's a deaf man from Melbourne, but he was well known across the country in Australia and also well known around the world. And that's achievable too. Anyone can achieve that from Melbourne, just like he did. Other people have spoken much longer, but I'll keep this short. I just want to say thank you all for coming, for supporting my family. Who knows, may come back here in another 10 years' time in 2023. We'll see you again. Thank you. Thank you, Craig. That was lovely. I think you hit the nail on the head. Life moves on, but it's important to stop, reflect, and remember who are the people that make the world what it is for us. Those that knew him, those that didn't know him, just to pause and reflect. It's had a profound influence upon my father. They were great mates, so I would see John every weekend at the football. And as Robert said, often people would say when a controversial issue or a political issue would come up, what would John think? What would John say? I'm really happy that you're here today with the Lovett family and friends. I'd love to thank the Lovett family. I know it's not easy to be here on this day, but really pleased that you're here to share it with us. Enjoy the rest of the afternoon. For the next, say, 30 minutes, enjoy afternoon tea refreshments. Thank you.